Hi, this is Michael P. Coleman, Content Director for Brother Be Well. Thanking you for checking out this series, this trauma and healing series brought to you by Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative. Powerful stuff to talk about, Christian. As serious as some of these adverse childhood experiences are, there's a pathway out. That no one needs to feel that things were so traumatic that they can't get out of that. Is that accurate?
Oh, most definitely. I'm glad you said that because the thing, everything we're talking about today, the positive, the strength based component of this is that things could be reversed. Just because you receive a score of a four doesn't mean you're destined to experience trauma for the rest of your life or be affected or impacted by these things. You through the proper treatment and healing techniques, there are ways to reduce some of those and some of these issues so they're not exacerbated more. So there is a hopeful course in terms of treatment and recovery.
Yeah, there's a light. There's a light at the end of that tunnel. Let's continue this conversation about the impacts of ACEs on communities of color. A lot of experts support the inclusion of racism in any culturally informed ACEs model. New research rather supports this, exploring the impact of racism on the experience of trauma, mental health, and health disparities among Black youth. What are your thoughts about that, Christian? And the follow up would be, do you agree with me? I'm always tentative about asking you that. I know you're, and I need you to tell me when I don't have it quite right. So I appreciate that. But I'm thinking if racism and historical trauma was included in that mix across the board, Native or indigenous children, for example, would most likely be similarly or equally impacted by toxic stress along with Black folks. I mean, when I think about the historical trauma of Native Americans, if we included that, that group would absolutely, there's a lot of trauma that goes on there. What are your thoughts about that in general? And really including racism and is not directly addressed in that ACEs screener, the current ACEs screener. What are your thoughts about directly addressing that if we really want to get at communities of color and help them undo and heal as we're talking about?
Absolutely. I think one of the main focuses, the reason why, when you look at disparate groups and the California Department of Public Health, they've labeled what disparate groups are, which is the Latinx, API, Asian Pacific Islander, Native American. They're included in that as well. LGBTQ community. So you're looking at these groups, African American. So there's a reason why that this group such as the Native American community is included, and they have different types of issues, right? So
Right.
just because their traumas are different doesn't mean they're not impactful in the same way in terms of experiencing police brutality and violence. The Native American community right now, there's a constant reduction in terms of alcoholism and things of that sort due to the rural areas that they live in. Some of the areas out in rural California, and that's no different of an issue than something happening within the city where you're experiencing police brutality and violence because the brain doesn't differentiate between trauma and toxic stress. So absolutely, I agree with you. And as we discussed in previous podcasts, the brain really looks at that trauma and processes it all the same. It doesn't matter. So the brain will process the trauma and looks at that experience, and then the gunshots. He hears the gunshots, and whether he was in Iraq or whether he was down the street on what avenue, that brain is going to process those gunshots the same way. With that being said, the trauma that Native Americans and their ancestors, it trickles down. It's a multi-generational effect. The same way for African Americans, the same way we've been affected by a trans-American slave trade for African Americans. So there's no differentiation in terms of how that looks. And so we also have to really remember that everyone, has experienced some level of trauma. I think that's one thing that I should have said in the beginning. Everyone has some type of, level of trauma and stress. And even on a small scale, we have some level where it exists there. It's just by living. What really matters is how we live with it and how we deal with it. So that's the differentiation between, the everyday struggle of dealing with stress versus it being, very prevalent and then affecting and impairing your daily living.
I appreciate that perspective and thought about you made you made several great points there, but one's going to stick with me for a minute. Let's take a slightly deeper look at that ACEs screener. Here's the question that's being proposed for addition to any culturally competent ACEs screener for parents and caregivers. And here's the question: to the best of your knowledge, has your child ever been treated or judged unfairly because of his or her race or ethnic group? What are your thoughts about that specific question, Christian? And then you've already touched on this. Systemic racism should absolutely be included. I know what your answer is to that, but as a marriage and family therapist, you deal with consumers all the time that are facing, that are managing and learning to deal with ACEs exposure. To the best of your knowledge, has your child ever been treated or judged unfairly because of his or her race or ethnic group? Does that question cut it?
It does cut it, and it really does get down to that point where we talked about race-based trauma. It's all coming together. We see that everything is starting to connect here. With race-based trauma, and these questions really, poking at those culturally competent, screening questions. And the cool thing about ACEs is that it's really becoming really fluid and organic in terms of the ability to adjust and adapt based on the institution and who's administering it. So I think we're going to start seeing more versions and variations of those screening tools as well that ask questions that are different from the a standard standalone assessment. And really based on all the studies that show the correlation between racism and trauma amongst children and people of color, that's really an appropriate question to ask. Just to be honest with you, I would also ensure that the question is really worded in a way that a child would understand and what it means, or a caregiver, because some of these tests are being administered with and along caregivers as well. So you want to make sure that that language is easily digestible as well, and the intention of your question is going to be potent, and it's going to be strong the same way you intended it when you reword it in a more simpler way. That's really important. It'd also be interesting to find out how children understand and how they conceptualize institutional racism, because it doesn't only impact adults, right? Based on their work or their health provider, things like that. Studies show, from Wellmind actually, that educational institutions and the K-12 curriculum basically is also subject to institutional racism, especially as we see the critical race theory notion elevating in our nation and things of that sort. So there's a lot of areas where we really have to really sit down and talk to the youth and see where their mind is at in terms of how they internalize and interpret, some of these things in terms of institutional racism, how they experience it in school.
It'd be a powerful conversation. We at Brother Be Well have had one conversation that I can recall, along with our colleagues with the Hawk Institute on racism, and we had a group of youth on ACEs rather, and we had a group of youth in, and it was interesting listening to those younger generations reflect on how they perceived whether or not they had been exposed to that, and racism wasn't even on that screener. So I'd love to have that conversation. Maybe we can have that here at the Brother Be Well on the Brother Be Well platform. As we get ready to wrap up, Kristen, I always lean into you. We do here for next steps. You're our marriage and family therapist. You've already pointed us to the light at the end of that tunnel. We know that there's healing. There's a possibility for healing. At least people don't have to live in the reality. They can have a high ACEs score. I have to say, every time you say a 4, I'm remembering my score is a little higher than 4. So you've helped people like me that realize that just because you've had that background, it doesn't mean that has to drive where you're going. So I'm wondering, my question for you is, how do people move forward? What are next steps, especially for communities of color? What would you recommend? I've got a feeling, as a marriage and family therapist, your first one might be talk to a mental health provider, and I think that would be a great first step. But I'll turn it over to you. What would be next steps for someone that is managing ACEs exposure or believes that they might be?
Actually, I'm gonna trick you because I think there's another step that should come before that one. Actually, I think it's really important before that therapy component come because it's so new, Michael.
Yeah.
This topic, this notion is so new that I think it starts with the education and outreach component. And really finding out for yourself and the resources to educate what is ACEs and how it looks, what does it mean, what are the definitions of it, how's it administered, really getting down because there's so much information out there. There's a ton of accredited sites such as acesaware.org is a very useful site. And that's the one, that was administered, they really show, it has all the provider tools on it. It's actually a place where I go to get my provider screening tools there. It has a ton of those webinars and treatment and healing steps and implementation plans on how to start the process within your setting or organization. So they're really trying to help you to, as a provider or a caregiver, kick this thing off for you so you can, use it effectively. And then also make, in terms of the therapy part is very important too. And I'm speaking on two levels. I'm speaking for as a consumer and also a provider. And as on a provider level, you want to make training a priority as well. So a great start in implementing those trauma-informed cares is really quality training, not just training, but make sure it's quality and it's up to date because things are changing, constantly changing in this area. And also you want to, as a provider, recognize what training cannot do. So there's a lot of areas that people think that once you go through, all the training, you're prepared, you're equipped, there's still a learning curve of actually administering it, and that hands-on training and seeing that even though you've been through the training, there's some things that it's not going to get you through, just by, simply, attending the trainings. And also on a caregiver level, you want to look at the caregiver capacity has to be, prioritized. That begins with recognizing that we have really under prioritized and underfunded a lot of programs. We have a lot of underfunded programs and agencies. So we have to consider that, the capacity and the ability to be able to train these staff. And you really can't talk about trauma without talking about historical trauma, right? So this is now back to the family and the caregiver. If we accept, the scientific truth about the effects of, unsupported exposure to an overwhelming violence on children, and we couple that with the new science of, epigenetics, then we really have to consider what happened to the community that the child is connected to. So we have to really look at that whole component of, educating, the youth in terms of, what your family history looks like and where that trauma lies. And now we're talking, we're getting kind of deep, right? Because now we're encouraging family members to share some of the old, bones in the closet of their family history, which is very important, which also helps break stigma within the mental health field, in the mental health area and community. And, and more than anything, it really, Michael, it really takes a whole circle. It takes like a community and really takes a village because the scope of the problem really requires collaboration. The underpinnings of this, problem, and, initially, in terms of making the collaborations natural and discussing multi-generational trauma and families so we can break that cycle of toxic stress. So I think those are the main components. And then I think looking at the therapeutic component and, getting involved with someone who can help you and who's understanding of what you've been through is a whole nother area I think would be beneficial. Making sure you find that provider who can understand and help you and knows your background.
The challenge, Christian, for conversations for me, for conversations like this, is we could go on and on and on. You've touched on so many important things, and I hadn't thought about the role of the community there, nor the educational. You're right. ACEs for us here at Brother Be Well, it's like small talk almost for us here, but a lot of people, there's a lot of information out there. So I appreciate it, you sharing those resources and really advising people of what those next steps are going to be. Really appreciate you all the time, Christian Jacobs, marriage and family therapist and Brother Be Well clinical advisor. Thank you, sir, for being a part of this conversation. Really appreciate it.
Oh man, I'm happy to be here.
And looking forward to talking to you next time. We'll see you soon.
Okay, take care, Michael.
Thanks, Christian. And thanks to you also for taking a look at this particular video. If you've enjoyed anything that you've seen, we encourage you to come on back. I also want to thank Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative. They're our sponsor for this trauma and healing series. The Blue Sky Initiative boosts access to mental health support. So thanks to Blue Shield of California for supporting Brother Be Well's trauma and healing series here. Thanks again to you for checking this video out. There are videos just like this one on a variety of topics, audio podcasts as well, compelling print pieces, all designed to support the mental and behavioral health of boys and men of color, 13 and up, African American, Latinx, Asian and Pacific Islander, and Native American or Indigenous. It's all at brotherbewell.com. brotherbewell.com. On board if you can, join us. We're a membership supported service, but you can also sign up for our blog with just an email address, and we'll start to send you notifications about pieces just like this one as they go live. So do that for me, and also do one more thing for me. My name is Michael P. Coleman, content director for Brother Be Well. And the one thing I want you to do as we wrap up today is take great care of yourself. We're trying to do everything we can to help you do that. Once you get it down pat, or at least get on your feet, so to speak, reach out and help somebody else. Until next time, bye-bye.